The government policy towards care homes in England at the start of the COVID pandemic has been ruled illegal. This is the policy that Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson described as a protective ring being thrown around care homes. I'm going to pause for a minute. This isn't necessary. Should we use this? Should this be our main topic this hour? I think it probably should, actually. Oh, we came so close to doing a motoring phone in, didn't we? One day it will happen. So it's the gulf between what they did and what they claim that breaks my heart. Okay, I listen. I do this for a living. I am essentially a very happy person. Outside of the news, life is sweet, sweeter than it has been in a very, very long time. But occasionally, I think you have to let the sadness rise to the surface. Not even the anger. Actually, I can do the anger. The anger's easy, but sometimes I think you just need to be sad. I've had a lot of therapy over the last few years, not so much latterly, but certainly the run-up to lockdown. I went into therapy, had a lot of therapy, and I found it so incredibly helpful, because sometimes all you have to do is work out why you feel the way you do, and suddenly you feel better. Talking honestly, getting rid of the stiff upper lip, getting rid of the notion that, it didn't do me any harm, so it can't be doing any other people any harm either. Just dealing with it. But what you can't ever do, the Buddhists think you can. Buddhism teaches that you can reach a point where you don't really feel anything. You're so at one with the universe, you're so zen, that the whole notion of happiness and unhappiness fades into insignificance because you're in a sort of constant state of equilibrium. I don't think I'm ever going to achieve that. Certainly not when Kid and Mr. Harriers are playing. But I do think that when you're feeling mentally strong, you should let the sadness in sometimes. It's part of the grieving process, isn't it? And I got to tell you that this story, and I only heard it when you did in the news, I didn't have early warning of it or anything like that, it genuinely makes me want to weep. I lost nobody in a care home over the COVID period. I spoke to people who did. I spoke to you sometimes every day. And I find the gulf between what they did and what they said almost impossible to believe, even though I do this every day and I talk to you and you talk to me and we share stories, and sometimes we discover stories together. We discovered during lockdown that people being paid to answer the phones on Test and Trace were sitting there watching Countdown all day. We broke that story live on LBC because people just rang in and told us. We discovered that the Ukrainian refugee scheme only last month was barely worth the paper it was printed on, because we spoke to people whose applications were being treated with such contempt that it was impossible to conclude that the scheme hadn't been designed to fail, which is exactly what a whistleblower told the Observer this very Sunday in the newspapers. And there have been many other stories that we have actually discovered together by talking about the reality of our lives. And this one is just gross. They sat there, they stood there, and some journalists let them, telling you that they had thrown a protective ring around our care homes. And yet they were essentially letting people with coronavirus leave hospital and move back into care homes where they would run the risk of infecting pretty much everybody in them. And the High Court judgment was sought by two grieving daughters, Dr. Kathy Gardner and Faye Harris, who both lost their fathers to the virus in care homes in the spring of 2020. Michael Gibson was 88, died on the 3rd of April. Don Harris, 89, died a month later on the 1st of May, both after outbreaks in their care homes. You'll remember that more than a quarter of all deaths among care home residents in March and April of 2020 involved COVID-19, and that is in excess of 12,500 people. All right, I lied. I am angry, actually, just then. Do you know why? Because I just remembered that he got all the big calls right. They're still telling you that. He got all the big calls right. He broke the bloody law. Got all the big calls right. We threw a protective ring around the care homes. I've given up asking you, what's it going to take for you to cut the cord? What's it going to take for your faith to break? He got all the big calls right, and they threw a protective ring around care homes. And we learned today that the government policy towards care homes in England at the start of the pandemic was illegal. Took 22 months of a crowd-funded legal challenge to reach this stage, essentially challenging the legality of policies advanced by the Health Secretary. Matt Hancock, who I'm told is writing a book about what a bang-up job he did during this period with his illegal policy and his more than 12,500 people dead. The lawyers for Gardner and Harris argued that the grieving daughters, argued in a judicial review that the government did the very opposite of the claim by the then Health Secretary, that, and I quote, "right from the start we have tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes." I'll quote you the judges, Lord Justice Bean and Mr Justice Garnham. "The decisions of the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to make and maintain a series of policies contained in documents issued on the 17th and 19th of March and the 2nd of April 2020 were unlawful because the drafters of those documents failed to take into account the risk to elderly and vulnerable residents from non-symptomatic transmission." This was when ministers and officials started pushing up free space in hospitals by releasing 25,000 hospital patients back into care homes without any requirement for negative tests prior to transfers. I'll say that again, no requirement for negative tests. And the daughter's argument, pretty simply, was that this failed to protect care home residents and was among the most, I quote again, egregious and devastating policy failures in the modern era. Is this you? I don't know what to do on this. Do we do the detail of this horror show, or do we do the politics of it? Do we ask again how these people can look you in the eye and claim that they got all the big decisions right and that they threw a protective ring around the care homes when judges in English courts have found that they acted illegally, that their actions led directly or indirectly to more than 12,500 deaths, and that they did so by avoiding the most simple requirement to test people before putting them back into care homes, requiring a negative test. What do we do? Do we do both? Do we do one? Do we do the other? You tell me. If you lost a loved one in a care home in the first lockdown, how do you feel right now? Say what you want. Maybe you don't mind. Maybe you think it was necessary. I'm not being glib. I'm not being facetious. I am not going to argue with anybody this hour. Well, unless, of course, you claim that they did get all the big calls right, or they did throw a protective ring around the care homes, in which case you need medical help, not an argument with a radio phone-in host. And I'll leave that hanging, that question. How can they do this still? All of them now. They've all been infected by Johnson. His moral corruption is as contagious as coronavirus. How can they still march around the studios? We'll leave for another day how so many journalists can still let them. But how can they still march around the studios issuing those phrases as easily as they break wind? He got all the big calls right. We've got to forgive him for breaking the law because he got all the big calls right, including the throwing of the protective ring around the care homes that Matt Hancock has boasted about. Right from the start, we have tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes. They did the precise and polar opposite. It's not just that they tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes and failed, which would be forgivable. We are, of course, all fallible. But they claimed that they'd thrown a protective ring around our care homes, whereas what they actually did was fire infected bodies into the middle of buildings containing the single most vulnerable cohort of human beings in our country. It's incredible. And why? Because they were terrified of the optics of overflowing hospitals. They were terrified of seeing scenes in British hospitals comparable to the ones that we'd seen in Italy. So they did not say, how do we keep people safe? They said, how do we avoid those pictures? How do we avoid that PR disaster? How do we avoid overflowing hospitals? We've got to look better than the Italians. So how did they do it? By throwing 12,500 elderly, vulnerable people to the wolves. And they still claim they got all the big calls right. I'm not going to let that go, I'm sorry. Sometimes when I find something emerging in the programme as a refrain, I find myself saying it every couple of minutes. I think, all right, mate, that's enough now, wind it in. I'm not going to stop saying it. I'm not going to stop saying it as long as I live. They got all the big calls right. And some people still swallow it. Some people still tugging that forelock so damned hard. They got all the big calls right. They broke the law. Look, it can't be. It can't be that both those claims are true. They cannot have broken the law by endangering the lives of vulnerable residents while also throwing a protective ring around the homes containing those vulnerable residents. It cannot be that he got all the big calls right when 12,500 people died as a direct or indirect consequence of a policy now adjudged in court to be against the law, to be illegal. Oh, he's doing his best. No, he got all the big calls right. Got to move on from the parties. Can't change it now because Ukraine. It's just incredible. How disgusting does the view in the rearview mirror have to be before you decide it's time to change driver? How much carnage and horror do you have to see on the road behind you before you decide that the clown at the wheel should be replaced toot sweet? I just don't know anymore. I really don't. And I didn't even know this story was coming today. And I don't know why this one's got me. As I say, I've got no personal... It must be because of all the people I spoke to during those mad days at the beginning when everything was unprecedented and unfamiliar and we didn't know how it was going to end. And we had no choice but to trust the people in charge, even though they'd achieved power by lying on an unprecedented and epic scale about turning the country to the first in history to impose economic sanctions on itself. Sat here worried to bits that the tactics and the dishonesty and the callousness and the carelessness that had propelled Boris Johnson into Downing Street would be evident in his treatment of coronavirus. But even I didn't see the absolute denial of reality coming, the complete denial of reality, to preside over this sort of horror and then claim that you got all the big calls right. To preside over avoidable deaths in the thousands caused by a government policy now judged illegal. Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock still doing a lap of honour. Riddle me that. So if this is your family that we're talking about, 0345 606 0973, how do you feel today? Because they'll never ask you. I will. And if this is not your family and it's not mine, how do we do this now? How do we deal with a political class, with a government, with a prime minister who introduces illegal policies that cause innumerable deaths among the most vulnerable people in our country, while claiming that he got all the big calls right and they threw a protective ring around care homes? Of course, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Regardless of your politics, however you voted, if you lost someone as a consequence of this policy, this illegal Conservative policy, I'm really, really sorry. Naz is in Enfield. Naz, what made you pick up the phone?
I just heard the ruling, and my father-in-law in end of February 2020, he was admitted to hospital from a care home for pneumonia. They sent him back in March 2020, and in May 2020, he caught COVID and died, and there's COVID on his death certificate. As a result, my husband and his family would look at him through the window outside the care home. So they couldn't go in with him when he died, and they were following the rules. And the fact that Matt Hancock ring fenced, the care homes, this is a direct result. So he went to hospital and he was better. So they sent him into the care home and he picked up COVID in the care home.
Probably from someone who had been sent back into the care home with it.
Yes.
Or it could have gone in other ways. So you never know for sure.
But no, we don't know for sure. But we're sure he didn't have it
when he got back in.
Yeah, because he caught it in May and he died in May.
What do your family feel? What do you feel on a day like today? Because sometimes, these stories wash over us. They're not going to wash over you because of your father-in-law's involvement in the story, really. But I mean, it still hurts.
Well, of course, because everybody was following the rules. My husband and I sometimes we were shielding. We were doing things that were asked of us. We did everything like most people, everything. And
it actually beggars belief, because I'm struggling to join the dots together, because when you mention shielding and you mention only seeing him through the window, every family member, whether they wanted to or not, was doing everything they could to absolutely minimise the risk of COVID getting into a care home. That's why we weren't allowed to visit.
Yes.
That's why the quarantines were in place. It's why the conversations were conducted through windows. It's why people couldn't touch their mothers in their dying days, because the risk of letting it into the care homes was acute. And yet the government were sending people, 13th of March, I think it was, that Patrick Vallance talked about asymptomatic infection, people who could easily have it even though they hadn't displayed any symptoms. And the government decided against, it would seem, the wisdom of their own chief scientific advisor not to insist on a negative test before people were allowed back into care homes. So you couldn't go in, but the fella in the room next door could, even if he actually had it.
Yeah, that's about it, because that's off the subject, but I lost my dad as well, and we couldn't go and see him in hospital. There was 2 members allowed to see him and 2 members not allowed to see. So the whole policy is just, I have to stick to the subject, but it's very raw, because both times we were following sort of like, to choose which 2 go in and which 2 go out, first come, first served. It's been a...
No, of course, and we should also remember that the time you were observing these rules and jumping through these hoops and doing what you believe to be right, Boris Johnson was having more parties than Jamie Vardy. And of course we're all supposed to move on from that. It doesn't matter, it's just fluff. Naz, thank you. 24 minutes after 11, and again, Naz, I'm sorry. George is in Hackney. George, what do you reckon?
Well, during that period I worked for the ambulance service, and I went to care homes, and specifically one registers in my mind quite significantly. I went there, and as we were going in, and we were in full PPE, and we saw the staff, and I literally said to them, have you not got PPE? And they said, no, we haven't. We've only got gloves. And
I remember this. I was taking calls from those people, wasn't I? I mean, I remember people telling us this stuff.
Yeah, and I said, so what's happening? And she goes, we've had 6 come in back from hospital, and we've got somebody who's really unwell. And we went up there, and it was clearly the COVID, and I took them out. We flew them down to the hospital, and by the afternoon I was back.
Yeah.
And there were relatives outside, because obviously they phone up the family, say, we're going to send them to hospital. So they rushed down, wanting to see their relatives, and they were shutting the door on their own the relatives of the patients they knew that were going to have to go to hospital, which was difficult for me, very difficult to see, as well as for the staff to do. And as one patient, he was that ill. We knew he had COVID because he'd been sent back to the care home, and he spoke Greek, and I speak Greek. And I said to him in Greek, it was non-verbal, and I said to him, look, you're more than likely not going to pull through. And a tear went down his eye, and I knew I connected, and it was hard. And it was hard, very hard to see that happen. And there were other events right through it. I mean, we were taking relatives out of care homes, and relatives were holding the doors of our vehicles open to say goodbye to their relatives. And 78-year-old woman prizing their hands off the door handle, and you know what's happening. You can't say it, but you're saying they're going to get through, but there's no chance. And it's horrific, absolutely horrific.
How do you then process the sight of them swanning around the studios, claiming that they got all the big calls right?
In two ways. One,
Go on, because I need a bit of help, George. I'm not going to lie to you.
I've had therapy, so
Have you?
I can say this
Yeah.
in upset, but not emotionally to the point where I'm going to start kicking the walls and so forth. So I've had therapy. It's been provided by the service.
Good, good.
But to me, they are murderers. They are nothing less than murderers. They gave us no PPE. We were running out of PPE. Were the points where we were driving around from station to station just to get a pair of gloves and a mask and some gowns. And, you know, they knew this was happening. We were forewarned. And to send chronically ill people back into hospital when they knew, I mean, we were being overwhelmed.
Back into care.
You could say it was an emergency triage system that, you know, those who could survive needed to be looked after, and those who would not survive had to, you know, make their means with God. And it was barbarism. Barbarism.
I mean, I balk slightly when you used that word there, the word murderer, not the word barbarism. But I mean, you know, this is your show as much as mine. You were driving flipping ambulances. I was just a gob on a stick. So if that is what you've come away with, and that is what, in the course of your therapy, has helped you process this, I am not going to argue with you, because it was a conscious policy. It was a conscious government policy, and we now know, I suspect this came as no surprise to you, we now know that it was actually illegal. And still they claim that he got all the big calls right. I mean, it's so at odds with observable reality. It's so completely contradictory of what the evidence of our own eyes and ears tells us, and yet we live in a country where people continue to lap it up, and much of the media continues to serve it up. The pom-pom waving client journalists still arguing that, he's doing his best, got all the big calls right, threw a protective ring around the care homes. Beggars belief, it really does. And do you know what? Things are so bad now, it takes something this big to remind you of the overall picture. It takes something this big. It's not just a little story like, oh look, they lost billions of pounds to fraud on the bounce back loan scheme, which we talked about in the first hour, and it doesn't hit you like it would have done 10 years ago. You found out the government had presided over a scheme that allowed fraudster after fraudster after fraudster to trouser money that you've paid in tax and waltz off over the sunset with a brand new Ferrari or a suitcase full of cash straight out of Stansted. That would have had us spitting nails at one point. Doesn't matter. You're so used to it now. So used to how much did they spend on track and trace, test and trace? Yeah, never mind. You know, it's only money. It's only money. It takes something like this now. It was actually unlawful. Unlawful. Not just silly or wrong or mistaken. Not just, oh, they did their best but they failed. They did their best but they failed. I'll tell you what's terrible. I almost don't want to say this out loud. I'll tell you what is absolutely terrifying, possibly the single most terrifying moment in the history of British politics, coming up right now. I think they did do their best. I think this was their best. I think a cabinet into which entry could only be achieved if you were prepared to inflate Boris Johnson's lies or sycophantically state your allegiance to the nonsensical project that propelled him into Downing Street. I think this is the best they can do. I think Priti Patel is doing her best. I think Liz Truss is doing her best. I think Matt Hancock did his best. I think Boris Johnson is doing his best. And it's catastrophically, and to use George's word, murderously awful. But hey-ho, on we go. Quite a few of you reminding me that Johnson suggested on television that deaths in care homes had been the fault of the staff. Enough of you reminding me of that for me to mention it out loud. I can't remember that personally. We should perhaps look for a little reminder of that. Although who'd be surprised? Who'd be surprised? You know, I talking about a man now who is beyond shock, and nothing he can do would shock me now. And yet, retrospectively, there is a sense of shock at the idea that what they did was so awful it actually broke laws. And all the time they were claiming to have thrown a protective ring around the vulnerable residents, and ever since they've claimed that he got all the big calls right. 11:33 is the time. Ron's in Waddingham in Lincolnshire. Ron, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'll talk to you about my mum, Betty, who was in hospital early March 2020. She was frail, but in good health.
Yeah.
And we got a call one day to say the hospital has COVID, so we can't go anymore. Then a few days later, it was your ward your mum's ward has COVID, and then a few days later, your mum has COVID. And we think, oh, God, this is not looking good.
Yeah.
And then about a week later, we got a call. She's been transferred to a care home.
Right.
And we're like jumping up and down. She survived.
Yeah.
She's mum.
So you're thinking she must be better because they've transferred her to a care home?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
There's nobody in their right mind would send somebody with COVID, actively with COVID, into a care home. Surely.
Ron.
It never occurred to us that could happen. So next news we got was a phone call to say we want to discuss end of life.
Oh, mate.
I think, oh my God, what's happening?
Yeah.
We never got to speak to her again.
Oh, Ron.
So it's pretty rough.
And a day like today vindicates you in a way, or makes some sense of what you went through, but it will never make sense of how this could have been government policy.
No, that's right. Just makes me damn angry.
I'm sure it does. But I don't know that your mum would want you to be angry. I don't know that she would want you to make yourself... Do you know what I mean? I mean, maybe she would.
I do, yeah.
I'm saying I don't want your blood pressure going up or anything like that. Do you know what I mean?
I'm on the tablets, I'll be okay.
Well, there's news today that you might be able to get an injection twice a year soon, which will save you all the side effects. But you know what I'm saying. I mean, anger is... I do. It doesn't get us anywhere, does it? I have to work every morning not to you know, let the dogs loose, as it were. But mine.
Yeah. You do a great job.
So you were staring at this story. You've been staring at this story for the best part of 2 years, wondering what the hell was going on. She was poorly. You get the call. She's going into a care home, so you automatically think, oh, well, she must have pulled through.
Yeah, exactly. And it was... I just couldn't believe it. We said, this call for end of life. What are you talking about? And I just couldn't process it.
And it happened so quickly.
Yeah, and I just couldn't understand how that could happen.
Well, now you can.
Have we got idiots in charge?
Now you can. And listen, I'm speculating on the rationale. I cannot see any other reason for this being, apart from utter idiocy, as you just alluded to, just literally having a bunch of clowns driving the car. But if the clowns had a reason for doing what they did, the reason would be we've got to make sure that our hospitals don't overflow. So get everybody out of the hospitals right now, if you can, in order to free up beds for seriously ill COVID patients, and yet they ended up sending your ill mum into a care home, and you know, she could have... Other people could have caught it as a consequence of her involvement.
Exactly, yeah. We never spoke to her again. And that's the hardest thing, I think.
Yeah, it is.
But it's done now.
It is.
Nobody's going to take account of it. Nobody's going to be accountable for it. Walk away.
What about when they say that? I mean, what do you feel before this story broke today, when you hear them saying we got all the big calls right? I mean,
well, you can imagine my thoughts.
Only just.
I was aware right at the start, because I kind of interested in stupid stuff and documentaries, and I knew about the Spanish flu. Right. Yeah. And I knew that we had so I thought, oh, okay, we can deal with this. We know what to do. But it's like they thought, oh, and we were at Eton. We know better than everyone else. We don't need to see the book. Yeah. How to deal with the pandemic.
I'm going to go and shake hands with some doctors.
Yeah. And it's been a complete disaster.
And on it goes.
Yeah, Ron, on it goes.
Take care, mate.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.
All right, we'll speak again, I hope, in happier circumstances. Nicola is in Croydon. This is what, and I almost deja vu, Nicola, to the worst days of the lockdowns and the worst days of the coronavirus, where I sat here every day, and for a while I was in my shed, actually. I was working from home, and I couldn't quite believe what was unfolding in front of us. And this feels like not only news, like not only a new scandal, but also a reminder of just how awful the absence of clarity and leadership was at the time. What made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hello. Well, I was a team lead at a nursing home at the first pandemic, and unlawful isn't the word. We knew it was unlawful at the beginning. We had to accept clients from hospital that we knew had COVID. We had to also protect our residents as well as our staff, but we wasn't given a choice. We were told that we had to accept them. Now, we knew, like I Topman has said, that we was putting everybody at risk, but like I Topman has said, we didn't have no choice, which then led to an outbreak within the home that I worked at.
You're just watching it in slow motion, right? You're just it's like an anxiety dream. You can see it unfolding in front of you, and there's nothing you can do about it.
There was nothing we could do. Obviously, we had to follow public health guidelines, which by law we all had to follow. And unfortunately, I even gave up, and I lived in the home to protect, so I wasn't going home. And we lost 11 residents that shouldn't have been lost. Now, these people work all their lives to protect themselves at their later on lives. And they pay a tremendous amount of money, a majority, should I say, because some can't afford as others. But they deserved a lot better. Now, they
all deserved a lot better, whether they were paying privately or not.
Whether they're not.
I know you didn't mean that.
Saying is the NHS. It was all about protecting the NHS. What about the social care? Unbelievable. The residents, the families, the staff. It was...
you're thrown under the bus. So it's a figure of speech, isn't it? No, I don't apologise to me. I mean, you vent your spleen. You have your say. What could you have done? Did you talk to each other about it? Did you say, what the hell is going on?
Yes, we did. We all spoke to each other. All we could do was do the best we can, which we did do, even with the residents that we knew we shouldn't have lost. We'd done end-of-life care with them. It was absolutely devastating. The second time round, we'd learned.
Yes.
And my manager, I will give her due, and utmost respect, she absolutely refused to take any clients or any patients from hospital unless they were literally negative.
Yeah.
She absolutely went against public health care simply because she was going to protect. The second time round, we wasn't going to go through what we went through the first time.
No.
And she got in trouble for that.
Really?
But she was willing to do that because she wanted to protect us all. And I just found it all absolute, and we knew it was unlawful at the beginning. None of them have got a clue what goes on in the real world, to be honest.
You're obviously right, or because the alternative is to think they did know what they were doing. And I don't think either of us are ready for that yet. The idea that this, because that Cummings said that Johnson said let the bodies pile high, and there are suspicions that they did know what they were doing and they didn't care, and that this was preferable. The deaths of your clients, the deaths of at least 12,500 people, quite possibly more. I've seen over 20,000 in Sky News is reporting that the calculation was that was the price they'd pay to keep the hospitals clear, to keep the NHS protected, so we didn't have those biblical scenes that we'd seen from Italy. And I'd rather believe what you said, that they don't know what the real world is like, they have no idea what they were doing, because the alternative is to believe that they did know what they were doing.
Well, exactly, but I just, like Topman said, I knew it was unlawful at the beginning anyway, and with it being
it goes against everything, doesn't it? It probably goes against the Hippocratic Oath, never mind the law. It's a simple...
No, exactly.
You don't do it. I think it was oddly, of all places, I think it was the Daily Telegraph that ran a piece by a doctor who compared it to a sort of 14th century siege when they catapulted the bodies of people who died from the plague into a castle so that they could infect everybody in the castle. Nicola's watching a live infection being bussed into her care home, literally wheeled in. And it was government policy and it was unlawful, but they did their best and they threw a protective ring around the care home. Somebody's got to snap, hasn't it, at some point, if you're still upholding this? My callers aren't. No one is likely to ring me and say, yeah, this is absolutely the plan. This is, I don't know what you're getting cross about, James. This is all brilliant. Off cap, tug, forelock, protective ring. It's just incredible that this gets sustained. I suppose people don't know. We fall into the trap sometimes of thinking everybody must listen. Everybody must know what's going on. But people are busy, and of course there's always invitations to get cross about something else. It's the Archbishop of Canterbury today, apparently, that you're supposed to be getting cross with for doing Christianity. I mean, it's outrageous, isn't it, when actual bishops get involved in Christian doctrine, teaching things like, I don't know, the parable of the Good Samaritan or whatever it may be, looking after the vulnerable. Say what you like about Jesus, he didn't give a monkey's about the vulnerable, did he? His business was all about billionaires billionaires, oligarchs and newspaper owners. Suffer little newspaper barons and come unto me? Something like that. So, it's time he wound his neck in, that Archbishop. It's coming up to 11:45. PMQs is on the way at 12. Be interesting to see whether or not Keir Starmer moves into this story, moves into this scandal. I suspect he will. He's a former director of public prosecutions. If anybody is qualified to walk legal minefields, it is Keir Starmer. But I don't know. It's broken very late in the day, and quite how Boris Johnson would talk his way out of this. A little reminder that you said you'd thrown a protective ring around the care homes, Prime Minister, and the High Court has just found that you actually acted illegally, and the policy contributed to more than 12,500 deaths. What would an unprotective ring look like? What would the absence of a protective ring look like? What would homicidal irresponsibility look like? We respond to news that's broken this morning, or a judgment that's been handed down in the High Court. I'll say this slowly, because apparently some people still need help understanding the severity of a situation like this. The government policy towards care homes in England at the start of the COVID pandemic has been ruled illegal. And then, in a masterclass of understatement, the Guardian newspaper adds, in a significant blow to ministers' claim to have thrown a protective ring around the vulnerable residents. Significant blow, being complete annihilation of the minister's claim to have thrown a protective ring around the vulnerable patients. The two daughters, grieving daughters, who brought the case had argued that the failure to protect care home residents was among the most egregious and devastating policy failures in the modern era. But he got all the big calls right. Roll up to the Boris Johnson circus. Among the most egregious and devastating policy failures in the modern era. And here is any member of the cabinet you care to name appearing on a radio show or a television station near you to claim that he got all the big calls right. Often unchallenged by people who get paid to ask politicians questions. Lee's in Preston. Lee, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. March 2020, after recovering from COVID, my husband couldn't wait to get back to work to help out with the catastrophe that was unfolding in front of his very eyes and all our very eyes that we could see coming. He's a community matron, so he found himself being called to care homes quite a lot. And it was clear from the first day back at work that this was going to be the disaster that we're all reliving today. People were just being sent away, and clearly this was an age thing. There's no other way around that. They were clearly doing this on an age thing of people who were near the end of life. And some people were miraculously just recovering pretty quickly, and then others were just disappearing in front of his eyes. So it's just bringing a lot back to me, because obviously I lived it with him as well. But the last person these people saw a lot of the time was him stood dressed in what can only be described as like a spacesuit. Yeah. The last person they saw was that.
Was him in his full PPE, it must have been terrifying, wasn't it?
And also as well, just on that, another thing Matt Hancock was saying at the time was the NHS will get whatever it needs. It sticks in my mind. We were delivering spare PPE that we managed to acquire to a friend of ours who was working on the front line in a COVID ward where these old people were being sent back to. When they were, majority of them were old people, were being sent to the care homes. Our friend didn't have the proper PPE to work on the wards that they were being discharged from.
You know how this works. I try and make sense of things that have gone, and I feel for your husband, and I feel for you. You carry this stuff forever, don't you? You can't get back from it. It's the opposite of why you go into a caring profession, just to watch people perish.
The thing is as well is that obviously you have to kind of share your work experiences, good and bad, and obviously patient confidentiality, etc. But there was stuff he said he saw that he would never share with me as long as we both live.
No.
Now, if he's got to carry, if he's got to carry that round, then where's the help for all these people? I mean, obviously the thoughts today, like with the people who've lost their loved ones in this way and didn't get to spend time with them, why people were popping out for booze for another party, go back to the worst possible government.
Oh, no, sorry, Lee, we've got to move on from that. That's just fluff.
Of course,
yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
There's going to be some interesting shows coming up on LBC, James, because I don't know how they're going to spin this.
I don't know who you could be thinking of. No, I don't either. But they'll find a way. Do you want to know what Matt Hancock has had to say? Because he's already started trying to spin it.
Oh, is he having a break from doing his book, is he?
I think he's taken a brief hiatus from Chapter 17. He's a spokesman for former Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the High Court has found he acted reasonably, but Public Health England failed to tell ministers what they knew about asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19, which makes it unfortunate that there is a radio interview referred to by the judges, given by, and I'll give him his full job title because Matt Hancock might have forgotten, the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, in which he highlighted the risk of asymptomatic transmission. So,
following the science at all times, apparently.
I'd forgotten about that one. Following the science.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeez. Do you worry about him?
I do, yeah. Thankfully, he's in a different role now. He works at a famous children's hospital around here, but he'll never. It's just bring it all back to all these care workers and these, the matrons like him and
you heard Nicola earlier. I mean, watching it happen, knowing it was rotten, and being powerless to do anything about it.
Yeah, all it's done is confirm what all these people have known for over 2 years.
Yeah,
that's all it's done, and it will bring everything back to he was coming home from work, and those famous press briefings that we all used to huddle around the telly for. I'm not sure why. And then, he's seeing it in the real world, coming home, having all these images in his head. And then you've got Matt Hancock coming out with stuff.
Protective ring.
Was utter nonsense. They will get whatever they need, protective ring from the start. It was just nonsense from day one. It's nonsense. And here's the confirmation of that today for all the people who still have the scarf tied tightly. For all those people.
What's it going to take?
They're beyond, James. Some people are beyond.
Hancock knows who he's talking to. It wasn't me, it was Public Health England. And I'll get texts like that next time we talk about this. It'll be, James O. Brexit. It's Matt Hancock's made it quite clear this was all Public Health England's fault. No matter that the government's own chief scientific advisor was warning about it on March the 13th. Please ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. And they're doing it. And it all comes from the top. The fish always rots from the head down. And like you, there are days when I wonder quite what the hell it's going to take for people to cut that cord or to loosen that scarf. Lee, take care. I'm glad he's in a better role now because there's something awful for you and as the partner, as the husband, to be told there's stuff I'll never tell you because you want to help. And sometimes, as we often talk about in this programme, just talking about stuff makes the burden a little lighter, just a little lighter. It's just gone 5 to 12. Theo will be with us imminently, I imagine, and we'll have a look at what might be coming up in PMQs. I'll trust his judgment on this because I don't know whether this is something that Keir Starmer is likely to present to the Prime Minister. I would both expect and hope so, but my ability to predict what's going to happen at PMQs is arguably even worse than Theo Usherwood's. Julius is in Weybridge. Julius, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to speak to you. Hope you're well.
Yeah, I'm all right. Not very happy today.
Well, I was going to say, you sound like you've got a heavy sigh in you. You need to...
Today I have.
Yeah. But I appreciate the show, and as I'm sure all the people who've lost loved ones do, and my heart goes out to them. So by way of background, I happen to have a lung issue myself, and I've been sitting in a room on my own now for a couple of years. So shows like yours are my social life.
Oh, crikey.
But I've lived, longer than expected, and in this time also happened to have had a career building and floating an IT business, or part of a team that did. So I've got some views on the NHS. And the reason for picking up the phone today was that I had a partner's father had a stroke at the beginning of all this, let's say March 2020. And I'm having some interest in risk and quality assurance and that sort of thing. I observed some things around his stroke management that weren't exactly top notch in the local facility, despite all the people having best intentions. So took a preemptive opportunity to call a meeting with his consultant to express my concerns and to suggest that when he was discharged, he would be welcome to come to my home and we would take care of him, and was assured this would happen.
Right.
And, of course, the reason for calling you today is to say that didn't happen.
And he went into a care home.
He went into a care home, whereupon he caught COVID, and the next thing we knew, he was back in hospital and a few days later deceased.
I'm sorry for two things. One's big and one's small. I'm so sorry for what you went through and for the fact that today's story must have brought all of this back in fairly horrible ways. And I'm also sorry that I can't talk to you for any longer, because the time is marching forwards and PMQs is pretty much on the horizon. Theo's just come into the studio, but you got the story across, Julia. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for highlighting it today, and be safe.
And I shall bear you in mind when I remember that I'm keeping you company, and that it's important at all times to find light among the darkness and to keep upbeat regardless of the gravity of the stories that we're discussing.